Okay, well, welcome everyone to our implicit bias training. My name is Gail Fest. I'm here with the Office of Advisory Neighborhood Commissions, and I'm joined today with my colleagues, Kathy Williams, who is on the phone, and Ronald Gaither, who is handling our technology as our tech specialist. So welcome colleagues and welcome ANC commissioners. This is a very exciting training and we really look forward to our presentation today. So the schedule for this is about 2 hours of sort of presentation mode. And then we will move to sort of topics to discuss. If we have enough participants, we may form breakout rooms. If not, we will convene as one group and work through all that we have learned together. Just for everyone's information, as with all of our trainings, this is being recorded. So it will end up on our YouTube channel. Just to let folks know, though, we will stop the recording when we get to the breakout, because obviously folks may want to participate and provide information that may be personal or something that we want to talk about just amongst ourselves today, and that the training, as with our conflict resolution training, will only be available on our YouTube channel for 90 days. So if you have other colleagues who are interested in doing the training, just let them know that there is a sort of start and stop as to when they'll be able to see it. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our presenters for today. We have with us Jamie Barden. He is a professor of psychology at Howard University, where he works on implicit bias and prejudice. He was twice elected ANC 4D 04 commissioner in Petworth, where he focused on parks, schools, and affordable housing. And then with him, his co-presenter today is Terrence Winston. He is an entrepreneurial activist, youth development specialist, community advocate, and restorative circle keeper. He is the founder and lead consultant of Paradigm Time LLC. So without further ado, I will get off mute and probably stop my video. I believe presenters, you're asking folks if they are and have the ability to put themselves on video, you'd like them to do that as well. So again, it's not mandatory. It's entirely up to the participants if they'd like to do that, but go ahead if you want to. And so Jamie, I'll turn it over to you and Terrence.
Great, and thank you so much. Gail and Terrence and I have given this training a couple times for ANCs, and we really enjoy it, and we like for it to be interactive. So it sounds like the way we're going to do that is if somebody asks to unmute in the chat window, then we can have a conversation, and we definitely welcome that sort of thing. I wanted to just start off with a little bit of an intro, and then we're going to do kind of the before assessment. So there's a little questionnaire you're going to complete. So, and after that, we'll do the training, and then at the very end, we'll do the after assessment. So I've tried to keep the assessments really short, but the OANC does want to see some information about the training. So that's why we go ahead and do that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just share a couple of slides here. The first thing to say is that this is implicit bias training for advisory neighborhood commissioners. That's what we're about today. Really quickly, because we want to be clear on what our goals are. The first thing is just to increase some general knowledge around 3 different general levels of bias towards individuals of different groups. We have the institutional level, which is laws and norms and practices, sort of diffuse. And then there's the individual level, and that breaks down into explicit bias. That is when people sort of overtly show in a way that they themselves know and everybody else knows what it is, explicit bias. And then we have implicit bias, and this is the kind of bias that we'll see where somebody may not be aware of it. That might happen automatically outside of their awareness. And so this is an interesting thing to talk about, because to show folks what that means and what we can do about it. Next, we'll talk about what happens when you're in a group like an advisory neighborhood commission and you're trying to make decisions. What impact does the diversity or presence or absence of diversity in that group have on group decision making? And you may be surprised by what impact that has. Then what I'm going to do is turn things over to Terrence, and he is going to talk about challenges when people of different groups interact more on a one-on-one basis. Okay, and then what happens when you run into a challenging circumstance where something has clearly happened? How do you move from being a bystander, kind of like watching things happen, to being an upstander for those who might be oppressed or stigmatized? All of that knowledge hopefully will motivate you to try and work towards reducing bias, and then we'll have a practical session at the end. That's that breakout room or group where we practice a couple of techniques to try and address that. And I'll turn over expectations to Terrence.
Thank you, Jamie. Nice to be with all of you today. So very quickly, the expectations of implicit biases are associations developed over a lifetime. So this is not a one-stop shop quick fix. So all of this is ongoing work, from the majority of us, lifelong work. And the focus of today is on race-based and gender bias. So we will not be touching on all implicit biases. It's tailored to those specific categories. And any oops or ouch moment we will pause and address. So that means that if something is said that is particularly triggering or upsetting, please bring it to our attention. We have the option in the chat function to send messages privately, either to Jamie or myself. So if, again, if you are feeling particularly triggered by a comment or any part of the presentation or something that one of your
It looks like we have lost Terrence here for just a second. I think he had completed his thought. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And I guess just to reiterate it, if you feel that way about anything that comes up, what we are going to do is we'll just stop everything, take a step back, and have a conversation. So we'll try to model the kind of responses that we're hoping to, that we're all going to partially learn from this training. Right, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this. Actually, Terrence's technical, I think, issues looks like fall conveniently in the moment when I have for us to do a little quick, sort of just a quick assessment of where people are before the training. So if you look in the chat window, you'll see a link. And that is a link to a Google Forms questionnaire. And if you would be so kind, it shouldn't take more than 8 minutes or so, maybe 10, I've shortened it up, just to complete that. And it'll also give you a sense of some of the content and topics that we're going to cover in the workshop. And then what we'll do is we'll have a similar one at the end to see what folks have learned, how folks have changed or stayed the same, and also for you to give comments. So please take a few minutes. If you just click on that form, you can complete that. And sorry, once you've completed the form, if you could be so kind in the chat window just to write, hey, I'm done, so then we know kind of when we can start back up again.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Welcome back.
My apologies. I'm having severe Wi-Fi issues. So
Hmm.
again, my apologies if I drop off. I certainly hope that it does not happen while I'm presenting. Did we begin?
Yeah, they're completing the questionnaire. So it actually fell at a good moment. So
Thank you. Yeah, just wanted to remind folks that the chat function is to be used, and that when one of us is presenting, the other one will be monitoring the chat. So. Most people completed the survey.
Yeah, that was my timer for the survey. I haven't heard back from anyone, but I think we'll go ahead and proceed. And hopefully that was enough time for most folks to finish most of the survey. So, right, so I'm going to start my sort of the run through of Jeremiah says done. Perfect timing. Thank you for the feedback. I'm going to go ahead and start my run through of just the kind of basic definitions of things, different levels of bias for folks. All right, so we have, first of all, I should just say, what is overall bias before we get into the 3 levels of bias? What is bias overall? And overall, that is more negative responses towards one group of people, whether it might be women, whether it might be African Americans. Those are the 2 groups that we're going to focus on today. More towards one group than another. Okay, so it's sort of a bias towards one group, away from another. And this happens at kind of 3 different levels that we're going to talk about. That happens at the institutional level. It happens explicitly from individuals, and it happens implicitly. And so I'm going to give kind of definitions and then examples of each. So when we're talking about institutional bias, then we're talking about laws and customs and processes that have a more negative impact on one group of people than another. Okay, so notice it's relative, and it's all of these sort of diffuse things that we kind of the underlying structure of our society in some ways. Then we turn to the individual level, and I think the person who's on the phone, I don't know if you can find a way to mute, or if Gail, could you mute them? I don't think they intend to share their audio. If they do would like to participate, I'm happy to hear, but I think that's unknown to them. Now we turn from the institutional bias to sort of the individual level of bias. And here there are kind of 2 separate levels. The one that probably seems more obvious to everybody is the explicit bias, that is openly endorsing more negative evaluations and more negative traits towards one group of people than another. So here we're talking about things that people are aware that they hold these views. They are intentionally engaging in certain actions to express them. And the kind of thinking that happens behind it is sort of deliberative. That is, it's sort of the kind of stuff that you hear in your stream of consciousness. Okay. Implicit bias is quite different from this. Implicit bias are associations that we've developed over a long period of time, associations between certain groups and certain negative evaluations and traits. Okay. Often we're unaware of this, and any sort of impact of implicit bias in that case is unintentional by the person. And it's also based on sort of just diffuse associations between a group category, for example, and different traits and evaluations. Okay, so those are sort of some distinctions, but I think examples are the best way to illustrate these distinctions. So institutional bias here are a couple of examples, one in education and one related to real estate and real estate law. So 2019, there was this study to look at K through 12 funding in the United States. Even when you control for differences in income, predominantly non-white school districts receive $2,200 less, 16% less per student than predominantly white school districts. Okay, that's today, right? Okay, so something is happening at the institutional level that leads to this funding disparities. As you think about your single member districts, one of the things that we wonder about is like, how come, what makes Bloomingdale different from LaDroit Park? Or what makes Parkview different from Pleasant Plains? Okay, well, there's a layering of histories of institutional bias based on race up until 1948, and when the Supreme Court struck it down. It was legal to have racial covenants and petitions in the deeds of properties. If you go in the deed of properties, real property here in Washington, D.C., you will see these phrases. Now they're unlawful, but this is the kind of thing that you would see. And what is particularly striking about this is, yes, there was a legal structure that permitted this kind of gross discriminatory practices, but it was residents who got together and signed petitions to get their block to add these sorts of things to the, to the deeds, or developers who are deciding it. So institutions don't come from, ether. Individuals are making those decisions and getting organized to do it. And so I remember in Petworth, my particular block did not have a covenant or petition, but I could look across the alley and parts of that alley did. So it was really individuals who were getting organized in that way. So that's an example, 2 examples of institutional bias at the race based on race. Here are a couple of examples based on gender. If you look at, the Capitol, all right, the seat of our democracy. Of course, women are underrepresented in both the House and the Senate. Well, literally the facilities available also are underrepresented. Until 1962, there was literally no women's bathroom on the House side of the Capitol. None. What does that say? The building is saying women don't belong here, okay? Or should not be allowed to be comfortable here, have to leave for certain purposes, okay? On the Senate side, it wasn't until 1993 that there was a women's bathroom near the Senate chambers. So that means that women might miss roll call votes and those sorts of things because of that, okay? So the building itself was saying something to women, basically. There was a group called the Guerrilla Girls in 1986 that, kind of publicized a clear, that the art world is the same way. What we elevate in art is sort of basically prescribing that women have certain roles and not other roles. So they point out that less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections, not the ancient, the modern art sections, Metropolitan Museum of Art, are women. But 85% of the nudes are female. So what this is saying is that the role of women, what the art institutions are saying is that the role of women is to be an object, to be objectified, literally, for their outward appearance, but not to be taken seriously as artists. And this prescription of, saying that women should or ought to do some things and shouldn't do or ought not to do other things is very typical of sort of gender-based bias. And we're going to see that again. Keep an eye out for that again. In fact, we're going to see it right now. If I can get the, there we go. So Geraldine Ferraro was one of the very first sort of major party nominees that was a woman for vice president back in '84. And she went down to Mississippi, and there was a Mississippi state official, Jim Buck, that she had a conversation with. And his comment to her, and just imagine this. This is Geraldine Ferraro is the VP nominee for the Democratic Party. And he says to her, "Young lady, can you bake a blueberry muffin?" And I think she's pretty quick here. She says, "I can you?" And his response is, "Down here in Mississippi, the men don't cook." The message is clear. Women have certain roles and men have certain roles. And the implication clearly is that she's too young and that her gender mean that she should not be in the role that she's in. That's that prescription. Notice in this case, though, we've moved to explicit bias because this is an individual making the statement. It's not an institution anymore. I have a couple of examples of explicit bias based on race. one of the things that we'll notice is that explicit bias based on race has become less and less acceptable in the United States. So both of our examples here come from like kind of crowded sports type settings. We have, there was a basketball game between two high schools in Indiana, and one was predominantly white, the other predominantly Latino. And the predominantly white fans were chanting "build a wall" or "speak English" to the predominantly Latino opposing team. Okay, so explicit statements of racial bias. Again, this is a very typical trope expressed towards folks who are from groups, some of whom have immigrated. To their credit, the British Knoll students shouted back, accurately enough, "You're racist." Okay, so at least they were able to kind of express that and process it and say that at the time. Not all explicit bias has to be in form of words. It can also be in the form of deeds. And we see here, this takes us across the pond to Great Britain. So we have an opposing fan that we have a forward in a soccer match who has scored, and he celebrates, and opposing fan threw a banana skin onto the field. Okay, that is very explicitly a reference to tropes of relating non-white individuals to animals. And so that also explicitly is very biased, even though it doesn't contain words. Okay, so now we've gotten through institutional bias and explicit bias, and I want to, I have a little activity for you all to try to start to illustrate implicit bias. So if you could do me a favor and see if you can unscramble these and unscramble them in order. So unscramble the first one into a word, and the second one, and the third one, the fourth one, and the fifth one. You know, I know the answer, so I know I'm done, but someone let me know if when they are done. You could even put in the chat window, if you like, put what your the last answer was. All right, Kathy's got an answer. Go ahead. If somebody could unmute Kathy. And Terrence, if you see something in the chat window, let me know.
She is unmuted.
Hey, Kathy, go ahead. What's your answer to the last one?
Pleat.
Mm-hmm. All right. Did anybody else get a plate, or did they get something else?
Oh, I got pleat.
Who is that?
That was just me. Unmute.
I think you actually got pleat.
Pleat.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I got. That's what I got. Pleat.
Pleat. Oh, okay. All right.
Pleat.
A platinum star for you, Kathy, on that one.
I was gonna say. All right. Anybody else? Okay, people aren't doing you don't like your unscrambling? This works. That's okay. So not all demonstrations are ultimately designed to succeed on every single time. I can tell you if I do this with a larger group, generally the majority of people get plate. And the reason that that happens is because because the four that come before it are generally unscrambled as fork, cup, knife, spoon. If you unscramble fork, cup, knife, spoon, you're more likely to unscramble the last one as plate. What Kathy has shown is that you can also unscramble it as pleat or pedal, right? Okay, so what's interesting about this example is that when the majority of people do unscramble to plate, they don't necessarily know that this is happening, but what we're tapping into is the associations that they came in the door with, that place settings, the terms for place settings are all related to each other. What that means is that if you are thinking about one or two of them, you're more likely to take something like EATLP and go plate with it as opposed to pedal or pleat. Now, Kathy, do you have a background in, I don't know, clothing, or do you have is there a reason pleat might have come to your mind specifically? I'm curious.
Can you hear me? I used to sew. It looked. I do when I just saw pleat.
Absolutely. So this is a great example of how. This is a great example, and thank you for saving my demo, by the way. So this is a great example of how our prior experiences influence how we interpret ambiguous information, right? So EATLP can go any of three different directions, right? Your prior experience led you to go pleat, even though over and above that temporary activation that I was trying to put out there. So what's interesting about this is you had to kind of explore and figure that out. In the moment when you chose pleat, did you know that that's why you chose pleat, or did it just kind of come to mind?
I saw EAT and PL, and I just turned it around, and I knew that was pleat.
So, right. So this is the essence of implicit processing. That is, you don't know why you chose pleat. It just popped into your head, right? That
Maybe,
that
yeah.
is an yeah. That's
I
evidence.
immediately saw that. I didn't see anything else but that. So
Right, right. So that's the nature of these kind of implicit processes. You can't tell me how you got from EATLP to pleat. It just was. It just came to mind, right? So that's that gives you a little sense of what implicit processes are all about. So thanks for indulging me with that, and for having interesting experiences that change the way that we interpret things in front of us. So we're going to see some more. That's going to be a theme here. All right. So the next question you might have is, okay, well, that's fine. But how are we going to even measure these implicit biases, right? All right. I just told you, you don't know, you didn't notice them. You know, you had the ambiguous thing, and then a word came to mind, and you don't have any awareness of what happened in between. So how on earth are we going to go about measuring it? Well, here's how. Okay. And I want to contrast it with explicit bias. So with explicit bias, the way that you measure it is you ask somebody. You say, you can just ask them directly, how much do you like or dislike Black people? How much do you like or dislike women? And they can put it on a scale. Okay, that's how we evaluate people on what we call a self-reported measure. Notice people get to choose their answer, right? So they're explicitly choosing their evaluation that they're sharing. Well, obviously this isn't going to work for implicit bias, so we're going to have to measure it what we call indirectly, right? So we have to measure it in a way that kind of decreases awareness that the person might have of what's happening, and allows those, like Kathy, sort of prior experiences and momentary information to come to the forefront and influence judgment. So I'm going to share three examples here. One is an open-ended type question. Another is a measure of attention, of eye attention. And the other final one is a response time measure. Okay. So we all think, and I think correctly, that elementary, early education teachers are wonderful people. So if anybody, you think, well, if early childhood education teachers have implicit biases, we probably all do, unfortunately. So this researcher went to a conference that had early education teachers, and they paid them to take part in a study. And what they did is they showed them 6-minute clip of these children playing here in the picture. And they said, press a button every time you see some sort of behavior from the child that could be potentially challenging or difficult to deal with, that could lead to an issue down the road. Notice there were no actual violations of like sort of behavioral rules in class in the video, okay? So what the additional twist here is that they put the teachers in what's called an eye tracker. So they're able to see what they're paying attention to, okay? So in particular, and then they broke the visual image into different zones for white boys, the black girl, the black boy, and the white girl. And so they're able to look and see which child the teachers are basically attending to or surveilling more when their goal is to look for potentially challenging behavior, okay? And what they found is that these teachers, even our early education teachers, were paying more attention to, were looking more at the two black children than the two white children. And they were looking more at the two male children than the female children. But above, over and above those two findings, they were looking at the black boy the most. And so we see that in terms of, you know, if somebody has the goal of looking for potentially challenging or difficult behavior, even if it doesn't actually break the rules, there's more attention paid to black boys. And so I think that's kind of initial evidence of this sort of implicit bias, because they also asked the teachers, which student did you pay attention to more? And their answers to that were completely unrelated to the actual amount of time each teacher paid attention to those children. So the teachers themselves are not aware that they have this attentional bias, that when they're looking for potential challenges, they're actually looking at black children and male children, and black male children in particular. Here's another example of a way to measure implicit bias. And this is with an open-ended measure. So remember, ETOLP is kind of ambiguous. A lot of times we see these implicit biases when something is kind of ambiguous. So they asked 1,600 elementary school children to draw a political leader at work, and you give them a blank sheet of paper, okay? And as you know, elementary school kids are really good at filling blank sheets of paper with their drawings and their thoughts and their ideas, their imaginings and so forth. So what did they imagine a political leader at work looks like? What do you think? Actually, let me put this out to you. What do you think they drew? Who do you think they drew? And feel free in the chat window, and Terrence, let me know. Okay, maybe the president. All right. So here, I'll go ahead and move on in the interest of time here. So here is what they drew. 84% of these children, and these are, 10, 11, 12 years old. 84% drew a white man. 16% drew a white woman. Very, very few drew black men, and I don't know if they had any black women. Okay. So this shows you, now, if you ask the children, they weren't thinking in terms of this. This is just what came to mind, right? Classic implicit bias, right? Okay, final example here, you say, okay, well, maybe, okay, this is fine. You've shown this with kids a couple times, with teachers and with kids, fine, but does this really matter in real world behaviors? Yeah, it really matters in real world behaviors. Okay, so here I have the ballot for Miami-Dade County for, you can see Barack Obama, John McCain on the ballot, along with a bunch of other candidates, okay? And so this study took registered voters and tried to see, would implicit racial bias measures predict voting behavior? And what's interesting is that they do, but they don't predict all kinds of voting behavior. They predict specific kinds. So explicit racial bias, if you ask someone, how much do you like black people? How much do you like white people? Like that open, explicit racial bias determined the difference between people who voted for John McCain versus Barack Obama. Okay, very explicit racial choice, right? If you use a measure of implicit racial bias, one based on response times down to a millisecond that people can't control, those kinds of things, what they noticed is this predicted people, registered Democrats, and for other reasons, folks who would normally vote for Obama, if they had implicit racial bias, they were more likely to either not show up to vote or vote for some third party candidate. Okay, all see these other folks? Okay. So you'll notice it's not as overt if they think about it themselves. If you don't vote or you vote for a third party candidate, you're maybe not thinking about it on racial, based on racial reasons. So for those individuals, they may not have been aware at all that their racial biases were playing a role, but in fact, they did predict important political behavior. All right, so, advisory neighborhood commissions, I was a commissioner myself. It's all about group decision making, right? So what happens if you're in a diverse group in like almost every ANC, right? Almost every ANC has, members of different genders, different races, ethnicities, sexual orientation, all these sorts of groups, right? It's almost impossible to find an ANC that is homogeneous, I should say. So what happens? And I'm going to, I think in the, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this demonstration here really quickly, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about something. I guess, what I'll just say, I'll just give you a thought experiment. Think about the last time that you had a zoning variance that came before your commission. I had a zoning variance, and think about how different commissioners saw it differently. I had a zoning variance come in front of, 4D, and, some commissioners saw a burned out building on, on a corner lot, big corner lot, and thought, and they thought, oh, aesthetically, this is ugly. I want to do anything to correct it. There was another commissioner that saw this was the friend's old house, and so there was a sentimental connection to it in that regard, and they wanted to respect it in that regard. There was another who saw that somebody was proposing some affordable housing, that might be an opportunity. Somebody else saw the jobs that someone might get if they developed it into an apartment building. We were looking at the same exact thing, but we were seeing such different things. And what I noticed is each one of us, it's like once you see it from your perspective, you think it's the right perspective, and you're just trying to convince everybody else that this is the right way to think about it. And so I just want to point out and invite you all to consider that if, once we had a real conversation in our business meeting, we were fortunate we had that conversation, we started to see that if you're going to have a holistic notion of this zoning variance question and this property, we need to incorporate all of those perspectives to say, okay, it can be all of these things. How can we respect all of those lenses looking at the same thing? So there's actual evidence that suggests, that tells us something about what happens when you have diverse groups. How is decision making different? Okay, and I have a feeling those of you who have been commissioners for a while, you may relate to some of these findings. Okay, So this is an amazing study. In Michigan, they went and they took individuals, they were given access to individuals waiting to be on juries. So it's literally the jury pool. And some of the folks that showed up there were a few that were African American and most were white. And so what they decided to do is they created mock juries, some of which were all white and some of which had 2 black members and 4 white members. And they gave them each of these mock juries, they gave them cases where the defendant was an African American. And the question is, what was different about the decision-making process when you look at an all-white jury as opposed to one that's diverse? It has a couple of African-American individuals. Anybody who's been on an ANC and had a meeting run over and their ANC is kind of diverse, you may relate to this. What did they find? These diverse juries deliberated more minutes, okay? More than like 12 minutes longer. They discussed more facts from the case. They also saw fewer factual inaccuracies expressed, and even fewer of those inaccuracies went uncorrected. So on any measure, the diverse jury, while they took longer, were more thorough and less error prone. And so, as you are going into like hour 2 of your commission meeting and you're feeling like, there's too many different perspectives here, it's taking too long, consider that you're probably, the process, even though it takes longer, is probably a better process. The same seems to apply for women. Here we're in the business world. This is a meta-analysis across 140 studies. And when you combine 140 studies that looked at boards, like corporate boards that have female representation, as opposed to corporate boards that don't have female representation, female board representation is associated with positive, better accounting returns for the company. It's associated with positively with 2 of the primary responsibilities that boards have, that is monitoring the company and being involved in the strategy ongoing of the company. So that's the kind of board that you want. And what's interesting about the jury study and some of the studies that went into this meta-analysis is that the change in behavior is not necessarily the women on the board or the black members on the jury behave differently. It's actually that the presence of the women on corporate boards and the presence of black members on juries actually shifts the behavior of the majority. They're more careful, they're more thoughtful, they're more detail-oriented, they get down to business. And so I think that's really interesting in terms of kind of the contribution that's made in that way by individuals who may not themselves feel like they're having as much of an impact because I'll just quickly show you. This is my current commission. I'm a former commissioner. There is 1 African American woman, 1 Latina woman. Okay, they are they have what we call solo status. They're alone and the rest are white men. But what's interesting, they may not feel as free sometimes because they are solo to say things, but their presence has an impact on the others, is what these data suggest. And my final point, and then I'm going to turn things over because everybody wants to hear from Terrence instead of me because I'm lecturing here. So my final point I want to make is just to consider for a moment the experience of anybody on your commission that does have that sort of solo status, that is that they may feel alone and isolated a bit. And that's something that you should take into account and see if there are things you can do, make an effort to make the person heard and included a little bit more. All right, so I'm gonna stop sharing there for a second and I'll happily turn things over to Terrence, and let me know, Terrence, when you're ready for me to share.
Thank you, Jamie. Just in the spirit, I know we've been sitting for quite a while, so if folks just want to take a minute just to get up and stretch. Unfortunately, it's 2 minutes to 3, so we're just gonna take these 2 minutes to stretch. And if you are not able to stand up and stretch like myself, because I have a very delicate technical situation here, um, if you could just take 3 deep breaths in and exhale. So deep breath in, count to 5, exhale. You can have your eyes open or closed. Another second deep breath in, count of 5, hold it, exhale. And one more deep breath in, count of 5, hold it, and exhale. Okay, we got to get some of that oxygen. Yes, thank you for letting us know. And again, please keep using the chat. Thank you to those, particularly Crystal. Um, and Jamie and I, prefer for this to be some kind of dialogue and conversation as much as possible, not a monologue. Before I go into my sets of slides, I just want to acknowledge that Jamie's portion of the presentation is very rich. Some of the content that he shared probably we could spend days on, particularly around housing and where bias shows up in these places. And one of the things that I'd like to comment on is sometimes it might be difficult to discern when bias is sort of coming up. And one of the things to keep in mind is, and Jamie spoke to this in the example he gave about the lot in the district. So I'm not from DC, so I don't know the terrain as well as all of you. I'm actually speaking to you from New York. But when Jamie was talking about people looking at the same piece of property, but having a different experience, a different interpretation of what was possible, that speaks to people having a different experience of the same thing, right? One may call it the Rashomon effect. Um, and it's important when we are engaging in biases, whether it's our own or someone else's, that we consistently make room for someone else's experience of either how we're behaving or responding, or how people are responding to our behavior, or how we're behaving, and how we're responding at the same time. Forgive me for getting that jumbled. So it's important because it leaves room for engagement, a different kind of engagement with each other. So, Jim, if you can pull the slides up,
Yeah,
please.
and I just want to give you a heads up. When I do share, I'm not seeing the chat window because all I see is this slide. So you may have to
Not a
keep an
problem.
eye on the chat window, and I apologize. I'd love to be able to do both. It doesn't seem like that's happening. So
Thank you for the heads up.
Under the chat
So,
as well.
people from different groups interacting. So in this part of the presentation, we're going to go, it's going to be, we started with sort of the underlying form of bias and what drives it. And now we're going to go more to the surface and give examples of how it plays out. In ways in the public sphere and also in interpersonal interactions. So if we can go to the first slide. So we have a video. This was the vice presidential debates of the 2020 election between Vice President at the time, Republican Mike Pence, and Democratic vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris. For those who saw this debate, it went right at the heart of gendered power and dynamics. And when we had a white male pitted against an African American woman. And if I can just share, Jamie, the video quickly. We have the transcript, but I think it's more dynamic if we play it in real time.
yeah, see if you can. Yeah.
Hold on a second. All right. We're queued up. Got the sound.
and truth. And the truth and the fact is, Joe Biden has been very clear. He will not raise taxes on anybody who makes less than $400,000
He said
a
he's going to
year.
repeal the Trump tax cuts.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
Well,
I'm speaking.
it'd be important if he said the truth. Joe Biden said twice in the debate last week that he's going to repeal the Trump tax cuts. That was tax cuts that gave the average working family $2,000 in a tax break every single year. Senator,
that is
that's the math.
absolutely not true. That
Is he
tax
only
bill-
cutting, is he only going to repeal part of the Trump tax cuts?
If you don't mind letting me finish, we can then
Please.
have a conversation, okay?
Please.
Okay. Joe Biden will not raise taxes on anyone who makes less than $400,000 a year. He has been very clear about that. Joe Biden will not end fracking. He has been very clear about that. Joe Biden is the one who, during the Great Recession, was responsible for the Recovery Act that brought America back. And now the Trump-Pence administration wants to take credit when they rode the coattails of Joe Biden's success for the economy.
Okay. Okay, can folks hear me?
Yeah.
There's no background noise. Okay, excellent. So, please, folks, feel free to put in the chat. Oh, thank you, Crystal. Please feel free to put in the chat your experience of watching that video. So there was a number of things going on simultaneously. So as we are familiar with some politicians, particularly the former president, the strategy of interrupting people while they're speaking. Now, one may contend that, well, Mike Pence would have done that to any opposition, you know, whether it was a woman, a man, another man, black, white. But that's not the point. And in this case, the optics matter, not simply because, yes, watch it. Yep, cringeworthy. Yes, it is cringeworthy. Not only because it is a familiar tactic and there was much passive aggression in there with Vice President Pence, but it was also masterful watching current Vice President Harris negotiate the interruptions and find a way to get back and regain her thought trail to articulate what it is that she was trying to say, all while not sliding into the trope of being the angry Black woman. She also maintained her temper and she did not raise her voice. So there were many things that she had to navigate and negotiate in sort of milliseconds. And depending, of course, on your positionality in relation to this country, blackness, whiteness, it's interesting how you might see that differently, because that's how I see it, right? But also keep in mind that someone else might experience it very differently. Some might experience former Vice President Pence's behavior as nothing inappropriate, that he's looking to win and that it's a competition. And in the heart of competition, you do whatever it is that you need to do to keep a strategic advantage. So that was a very, very telling exchange. And if you had seen the entire debate, there were many other moments over the course of that debate. There's actually another video on YouTube, if you're interested in seeing it, where someone actually captures the metric of how many times Vice President Pence interrupts Vice President Harris. So can we go to the next slide, please? All right, thank you. So here what we have is we've juxtaposed some traditional gender stereotypes. Now we know that stereotypes are often rooted in some truth, but these are limitations. And as we see on the feminine side, we have dependent, submissive, passive, talkative, verbal, gentle, emotional, nurturing, and tactful. And then we have the masculine, independent, dominant, active, assertive, tough, resilient, logical, and blunt. Now, I think this is an appropriate slide subsequent to the prior slide in the video that we just saw, because we watched, again, Vice President Harris actually have to reconcile not only the feminine side, but also the masculine side. She actually had to synthesize the two, because we know that politics can be competitive. I mean, I'm sure many of you in your respective roles have moments where you must assert your constituents' agenda in order to really either get heard or get anything done. And the thing about these gender stereotypes is that men and women, we have both, right? So, it's not this sort of hard dichotomy that you're either one or the other. You often have aspects of both. And I think what was demonstrated quite skillfully by Vice President Harris was she was tactful and she was resilient and tough at the same time in that moment. She was also assertive. She was asserting the agenda of her running mate. And she also relied on data to gird her point, which was logical. She also was gentle in that moment and not aggressive. So meanwhile, Vice President Pence was probably heavily on the masculine side in his presentation. He was assertive. He came across as tough. He seeked to dominate the debate and did not really subscribe to any of the sides on the feminine side. So, maybe much to his detriment, depending on, again, the particular lens in which you might have been observing that debate. Next slide, please. So something else, these biases can have dire consequences. And in some instances, there could be life or death. And that's not I'm not speaking hyperbolically. One of the things is the difference between men and women and how symptoms show up with cardiovascular disease. So it was conventional wisdom that pain in the chest and down the left arm was a sign of perhaps some sort of cardiovascular ailment. What was lesser known is that those particular symptoms tend to be symptoms that exist in primarily men. Women, conversely, have different symptoms. They may have weakness, fatigue, a heartburn-like feeling, nausea or vomiting, or cold perspiration. So if a woman is exhibiting those kinds of symptoms and they may go to a cardiovascular specialist, there may be a misdiagnosis. Or if they go to their general practitioner, then they may get diagnosed as not really having a problem as severe as heart disease. So imagine that. Imagine how many women that had experienced those symptoms and that led to perhaps a severe cardiac arrest. And it was because of looking for something that was familiar in men and expecting that the same thing to be in women, which goes to an important point about this notion of sameness, right? That somehow the goal is for us to be treated the same in all instances, and that equity and equality is sameness. That's not what we're talking about. And I encourage you not to be pigeonholed into, well, these comments of like, well, you're just as good as, right? That was something that was introduced to me many years ago, that I'm just as good as so and so, as if being just as good as someone different from me is somehow the goal. That's not the goal. The goal is to understand someone else's experience and to treat and approach them the way that they should be and they need to be addressed and treated and engaged with in a way that's best for them, not what's most comfortable and best for you. So, can we go to the next slide, please? Again, another health-related slide. The snow clearing of major roads at one point tend to prioritize the needs of men who are traveling. since they have priority of cars. This is an example in Sweden. I know that this may be a little dated, particularly in some countries where, there are women who are increasingly becoming the primary earners in a family, and men may be staying home. But in Sweden, the cities began to prioritize sidewalks, bus lanes, and bike lanes to make sure that they were clear. And it had a positive benefit. It greatly decreased the slip and fall of women that were hospitalized. Um, and the hospitals had neglected to look at gender, and they missed that it was women that were getting injured. So again, the bias in this particular instance was the needs to clear roads and to make sure that conditions were optimal so men could get to work and meet the needs of their family, and concurrently neglectful of the needs of women who also make up partially make up the fabric of society. So this is how it plays out. And again, we're doing this sort of very quickly and expeditiously, but think about sort of the potential ripple effect, right, of these kinds of things. Think about the effect that it may have on a family that has small children. Think about the effect that it may have on a family where the mothers or the women may also be caretakers to elderly. So it matters. Okay. So back to what has been a familiar image here, the uh, the the intersectionality of white men in power and Black women, a highly skilled and reputable Black woman. Those who are old enough to remember the confirmation hearings of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, who testified her experience of harassment by Justice Thomas, and current President Joseph Biden, who actually was the chairman of the Inquisition Committee. So this is about apologies and responsibility and accountability. So just a few things about the process of accountability. And if folks would like to put into the chat how they define and understand the term accountability, that would be very helpful. So I just want to take a minute for that before I respond. So please put in the chat, how do you define accountability? Make sure that folks are still with us. Okay, we're not getting much, so we're not going to take up too much time. Okay, thank you, Crystal. Crystal, you never disappoint. All right, Jeremiah, here we go. Acknowledging wrongs and taking responsibility for actions. Thank you. The buck stops with me. Yep. Harry Truman would be proud. And ownership. All right, excellent. So yes to all, but I'd also like to take it as I also like to sort of parse it out a little more. Accountability, especially in the world that I exist in professionally, particularly in the Department of Education, accountability was a term that got co-opted by the compliance drivers, and it became a word to admonish and indict people, in order to get them to sort of do the right thing or do what people want them to do to fulfill their agendas. As opposed to accountability can be a supportive mechanism as a way to bring people together and to get to a better mutual understanding of a particular either topic or task. So accountability is and it's something that cannot be forced, right? You can't force someone to be held accountable and it be something that is meaningful and lasting. It's got to be something that is earned, and it's got to be something that is in some ways reciprocal, right? So if I'm in a relationship with Jamie and I do something to violate that relationship, not only must I be prepared to apologize, but Jamie must be in a position to receive the apology, right? So just because I say I'm sorry, or I take ownership of something that I did, doesn't mean that that's the most important thing necessarily. That's the only thing that has to happen in order for the relationship to move forward. And the other thing is, it's incumbent upon the both of us to really understand what is it that I'm apologizing for, and what was the harm that actually occurred, and how is the harm potentially impacting our relationship, and what can be done after the reparation of the harm for hopefully it not to happen again, right? So there are layers to it. So if we can go back to the slide, please, Jamie. So in this moment, Ms. Hill had told the media that Joe Biden told the media that he apologized to Anita Hill in private in 2019. And quote, the quote next to it is, an apology to be real and sincere has to take responsibility for harm. This is Ms. Hill. He didn't hold himself accountable in any way except that he was sorry that I felt I wasn't treated fairly. I repeat, except that he was sorry that I felt I wasn't treated fairly. So he puts it on Ms. Hill, no ownership. He didn't take ownership of his role as chair of the committee. Publicly to ABC News, Joe Biden said, as the committee chairman, I take responsibility that she did not get treated well. I take responsibility to that. Quote, there was a statement about I take responsibility back to Ms. Hill. I hold myself responsible for the way the way the hearing was run. Said I think is as close as we've gotten, and that's good. So here is President Biden not really taking full responsibility and ownership for his role in what was a situation where it took extraordinary courage on the part of Ms. Hill to actually step forward in that way. And, you know, one could make a very strong argument to say that it had drastic consequences on the trajectory of her career moving forward. And this is something that occurred, 30 years ago? 1991. If my time is correct, please correct me if I'm wrong on the timeline. And again, he didn't hold himself accountable, and again put it on Ms. Hill that she felt a particular way because she wasn't treated fairly. She felt she wasn't treated fairly, as opposed to she wasn't treated fairly, which is a point of fact, and that in his role as leader, it was incumbent upon him for it to be an environment where she should have felt as safe and as heard as possible, which was clearly not her experience. So again, I reiterate for emphasis that it's not simply about your experience; it's about the experience of other people that are engaged in an interaction and/or a relationship, and how these biases come up in a myriad of ways, and how the harm that can happen when bringing bias, and whether or not you're in a position of authority, how it can reverberate, long after one engagement. Can we get to the next slide, please? Okay. Interracial interactions. So I'm going to ask permission for something. I'm going to ask for because we can't see anybody on this particular call. Can people write in the chat how they identify themselves? I'm going to leave it like that. How do you identify yourself? Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Crystal. Okay, share pronouns. Okay, I'm looking at, let me just see, African American. I assume AA means African American, Denise, or it might be Asian American. I'm not sure. So, Jeremiah Montague, a person. There were no consequences for him. The cadre of individuals go and check for inappropriate behaviors in the context of SWS. Historically, melanated people have had to comport themselves a certain way in order to survive. Thank you, Denise, for putting that in the chat. So as we transition to this next slide, thank you all for responding with how you identify in the chat. I just want to say, just to contextualize this next slide, these are sort of sweeping statements, and there and in preparation, I don't think Jane would mind me sharing that he and I had an interesting conversation about the nature of cross-racial relationships, specifically white and black, and how how some may or may not evolve over time, depending on the individuals and also the community in which they belong, and what kind of support the individuals in the relationship may or may not receive based on the community that holds that relationship. Now, I don't want to go on a rabbit trail with this, and I certainly look forward to having this. I look forward to having this conversation with the attendees. But getting back to the slide, in an interracial reaction, there are often different worldviews based on the racial identity of the person that can sometimes clash in a particular kind of engagement, personally or professionally. But in this case, we're going to speak to the professional. So we'll start from the right. The Black professional, their goals are to be seen as competent and respected. And I want to pivot back to Denise's comment in the chat. Historically, melanated people have had to comport themselves a certain way in order to survive. I think that it is a short and appropriate leap to go from that comment to be seen as competent and respected, and prioritizes relationships. So this is critical. A Black professional is going to center relationships. They may not focus on title. They may not focus initially on compensation. I'm not saying that it is not important, but on the list of things that are prioritized, at or near the top is going to be the relationship of the people that they are in community with in the workspace. They are looking for an acknowledged synthesis of their individuality, race, and ethnicity. This is why I'd asked the question in terms of how you identified yourself in the chat. So to the left, the white professional, the goals, again, a broad statement to be seen as likable and in control. There is an assumption on the part of most white professionals that they are already respected and seen as competent. It would never occur to a white professional, given the fact that they are already in the role, that no one would see them as incompetent, right? That is not something that they would necessarily have to prove. Or there's often not insecurity about that. White professional will prioritize rules, systems, and structures, not necessarily the relationship. So in that paradigm of rules, systems, and structures, there is often the other people that are within that are cogs or objects, right? So you want the system to run, you seek compliance to the rules because it's important to achieve the outcomes and the goals. How people feel, how people are treated, their individual needs, that is secondary or tertiary to the goal of necessarily getting things done, right? You may hear, and there are many terms like you have to drive the business. We're an outcome-driven business, right? We want to meet the bottom line, right? And then you have other language like we have to meet these deadlines. And the last part is they're looking to portray themselves as not biased, often presenting the self as colorblind, right? So, I don't see Crystal B. I don't see Crystal B as a Black woman. I see Crystal just as a human being or as a person. Right? Now, on first blush, that may be a positive, right? And that may very well be intended. But if it's important to Crystal's identity that she be acknowledged as an African American or a Black woman, and whatever, as a lawyer or a doctor or an architect, then she gets to define who she is and how she gets seen, and not the other person. And that's important. And again, imagine how heightened the importance that takes on if you are someone that prioritizes relationships. So if it's important to me that I am seen as a Black man, an erudite Black man who has multiple interests and is a restorative practitioner and a community organizer, if I'm in a relationship with someone and someone is neglectful of that and takes a reductionist approach and just sees me as, well, Terrence, I just see you as Terrence, I may feel a way about that because I've worked hard at integrating all of the different parts of my personality in a way where they are not deficits, but they are strengths, particularly in a society where there are always multiple ways in which I am being devalued. Right? Starting from when I was a boy, right? Going back to Jamie's early example of the classroom and who was the most closely watched by teachers. So again, we're really trying to do a job to kind of synthesize and suture all the different component parts of this presentation to create the arc of a particular narrative that's informed by bias, and how not only do we have biases, but the amount of work and discipline and restraint at times it takes to overcome these biases so we can fully actualize our potential, not sometimes to our benefit, but to the benefit of others. And particularly for your roles as advisory neighborhood commissioners, you are in service to others. So it only makes sense that you would have the opportunity to be your best and full self in order to execute your roles for your communities. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right. Now we're going to move to bystander upstander. Thank you, Jerry, for joining us today. Yes, as an ANC, I'm just looking at the comments in the chat right now. As an ANC commissioner, there are constraints. Thank you, Jeremiah. All right. So moving from bystander to upstander. Again, this is a presentation that can stand on its own, but we're going to try to go through this very quickly. And the emphasis here is when you see something, what are some of the things that you can do, perhaps to either intervene or to advocate? Next slide, please. All right, so when you decide to intervene, it's important to do a diagnostic in the moment to figure out where is the best place to get involved. Right. So let's start with to the right again, the don'ts. It is highly discouraged to shame, guilt, invalidate, or validate, placate, patronize, judge, internalize, or make it about oneself. Right. So when we see something, harm that might be occurring, either to ourselves or to someone else, the tools on the right are often not the most useful way to go. To the left, though, however, we want to engage the person or persons. We want to ask questions. We want to provide information when appropriate. We want to invite in a conversation or a dialogue. We want to develop some different kinds of thinking or perhaps a relationship after the initial engagement. We want to stimulate new thinking, to think more expansively, to think maybe deeper on a particular, on what happened. And we want to provide support ultimately to all parties that are involved. And, that's work, right? So, some years ago, I had taken a training at the University of California, Berkeley on the Greater Good Institute. I don't know if folks are familiar with it. And it was where I learned that for every negative thing that we hear, it can take 5 positive things to counter that. So cognitively, we are hardwired to take in the negative. So in intervening in a situation that might be hot, right? We have to be really careful and specific about what our intention is and aware of what the potential impact can be of getting involved. And no judgments, right? Sometimes when you make the decision to step up and be an upstander, sometimes you may not get it right. You know, it happens. Um, a quick story. I was in, I do some work in a juvenile justice center, and there was a young man that tried to advocate for a woman who is a worker there who is being disrespected by a resident. And in the process of being an advocate, he called the woman the B word. And then it became a big deal because of his inappropriate language. And there was an instance where it became sort of a hot mess because the focus became on the language that he used in addressing a woman as opposed to the action that he took to try to intervene and be supportive of a woman who was being disrespected in the workplace. So again, um, you may not always get it right, but going back to what we said earlier, it's always important to hold oneself accountable and be prepared to apologize and to keep trying and to continue to seek support to be better, hopefully in future engagements, because when we're in the business of supporting people and in relationships, there are always going to be more opportunities. Next slide, please. All right. These are some questions that you can ask when you choose to get involved. We want to slow things down, clarity. We want to acknowledge what has happened. We want to solicit or provide information. We want to be able to we want to see if there is a disconnect between intent and impact, something that happens often. We want to be able to provide the actors with agency, and we want to seek a resolution if possible. And again, this doesn't do justice with the time frame in which all of these things might have to happen. Sometimes these things can be expedited. Other times these things may take a frustratingly longer time. But if we subscribe and adhere with fidelity to some of these intervention questions, hopefully there will be more positive outcomes that will benefit the people within the process. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, Jamie. I'm just reading the chat. Kathy, I'm uncomfortable with interrogate. How do I control this tool without being told that I am judging or that I believe the person to be guilty? Okay. So can we go back? Yes, thank you. So interesting, Kathy. The language that you're using. So can you take yourself off of mute? Is it okay if we talk about this? I'm supposed to. I want this to be it's kind of a one-way lecture. And I don't want to misinterpret or make any assumptions off of what you're saying. Can you please clarify for me a little more what you're referring to?
Well, when a matter happens or during an incident and questions are posed, I guess it's the manner in which I would pose the question. I would not want the individual to believe that I'm making an assumption that they're guilty by the questions that I'm asking, or that I believe guilt, or why are you asking me these questions? You've already made up your mind. That sort
Okay.
of thing.
Thank you, Kathy. So I my suggestion is that you ask open-ended questions. That is often a disarming way. That is often a disarming method of inquiry because you really want to be clear about what your goal is. Is your goal to better understand what happened, right? If the goal is to achieve compliance and a swift resolution, that will shine through. And if interrogate is too strong of a word, then inquire I don't know is that more palatable. I don't really want to get into semantics necessarily. I think interrogate.
I think, yes, I like that better. When I think of interrogate, I think of someone basically being placed under a lamp. And you're
All
correct.
right.
I like an inquiry, and
Understood.
possibly, I don't know if I'm making any sense. Can an inquiry be reciprocal? Can I inquire and yet engage that person at the same time? What do you
Yeah,
think?
absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Why not?
Okay. Okay.
Now, I'm sorry, Kathy, are you still there?
Oh yes, I'm here.
Denise Wright put referred to, she wrote something in the chat, referred to one of my heroes, Denise, and I wish I had half the intellect of Dr. Edwin Nichols. Edwin Nichols changed my life. And I wish we had time to talk about some of his work in diurnal logic and the dynamics between diurnal dichotomous logic. And I'm not gonna go off on a tangent, but bless you. And I forgot I'm with the DC folk, and I highly recommend anyone to get a hold of Dr. Edwin Nichols and maybe some tapes of his work. You might be able to YouTube him, but he speaks much more eloquently than I am about a lot of these dynamics that we're talking about. But back to you, Kathy. Yes, you know, it can be a reciprocal process. Actually, as a restorative practitioner, you're really speaking my language now. You know, it could be a dynamic where if you are sitting in circle and may have the time and the inclination to do so, that would be the perfect sort of structure to be able to have the kind of inquiry that we're talking about to get to a satisfactory resolution and perhaps some agreements amongst community members on how to proceed forward effectively, and also in the process make sure that no harm happens in the future based on the agreements that you come up with, and ones
That's
that
good.
which you can all take ownership and accountability for.
That's good. Thank you. That's good. That's good. I like that.
You're welcome. I want to be mindful of time. Jamie, I have 5 minutes left. Yes. Are we over?
Yes, yes, we do. Although I'm not going to enforce deadlines here because we're in conversation. So,
Okay, thank you. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right. So again, more action steps. And I think, Kathy, thank you so much for your question, because it actually can put maybe some of what we talked about would be more helpful connective tissue.
Okay.
So starting from the top, we'll work our way down. We assess the situation. So, again, the question is what happened, who is involved, who might be harmed, and where do I fit into this equation? Am I the best person perhaps to engage with the situation? Then the next one is, once you've been able to ascertain the nature of the situation, where do you fit in? What is your primary relationship? The third is interruption, and this is the upstander portion. Ask if the person is okay that may have been harmed, and choose to support or listen based on the response. Now, another tack is ask the person who may have harmed, may have been the perpetrator of the harm. And forgive me for sliding to the perpetrator victim paradigm, but as I'm trying to do this to emphasize a point. Again, I try not to subscribe to hard binaries, but perhaps the person that did the harm, ask if they're okay as well, right? And that may be tricky, but it also is going to depend on your nature of the relationship to the situation. Because let's say, for example, Jamie and I are in conflict, and I'm going to lean on you, Kathy. You are the person that is the bystander in this situation, and I've said something disrespectful to Jamie. However, you have the primary relationship with me, right? And
Okay.
you want to maintain the relationship with me, but you realize that there's been harm that's been done to Jamie, and you may have a light acquaintanceship with Jamie. In that moment, you may pivot to him to see if he's okay. But
Yes,
if you know me and you feel as though you know my character, you may also turn to me and say, Terrence, are you okay?
I
Like,
would.
this is really so unlike you. Like, I'm frankly, I'm surprised that what I just saw, what I just heard, right?
Right, but Terrence, didn't what you
Yes.
just said? Okay, Terrence, are you okay? Now correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that if I were to say to you, frankly, Terrence, I'm quite surprised. haven't I gone a little bit too far and I might be putting you in some sort of a defensive mode too?
It depends on the nature of the relationship.
Gotcha. All
That's a
right.
great question,
Gotcha.
Kathy. So, Kathy, I'm talking like, we're like, Ace Boone, like we're buds,
We
right?
kick it. We kick it.
Like exactly. I mean, kick it hard. Like, so you've known me for years, been to my house, you know my, you know my mama, like that kind of relationship.
Gotcha.
And for you to, because sometimes in the question, it gives a person pause. It's not necessarily just about getting information. Sometimes, depending on the relationship, it's about stopping someone and getting them to, because listen, I've had a homeboy where I was in a situation where I really lost my temper and I almost blacked out. And it was just simply by hearing my friend's voice saying my name, it sort of snapped me out of it and really stopped me from potentially doing something harmful. Right. So again, it's very layered. And I appreciate you asking the question, Kathy, because yes, there are times where depending on your connection to the person, they may go to the defensive.
Yes. Yes.
And again, they may go to the defensive in that moment, but later on, they may be appreciative of the fact that you said something.
Okay. Okay.
Because sometimes you may be the one that has to get the arrows, right? As you upstanding for Jamie, I may redirect my ire towards you.
Exactly.
Like,
Exactly.
and
That's what
listen,
I'm looking at.
that's a judgment call, right? And again, that's a judgment call on whomever is choosing to be the upstander. And again, if depending on your comfort level, if that's something that you're not comfortable doing,
Yes. Yeah.
then you need to take, that's a self-care issue. But if you're someone that like, well, he's tripping, I've seen it, I'm not necessarily afraid of his anger, I know that it'll subside, I'm willing to sort of step in because I don't, what's happening right now is not right, and
Yes.
I have
Yes.
to intervene.
Good point. Thank you. Thank you, Terrence. Good point.
You're welcome. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, the last one is document. Always keep a record of what happened, because sometimes when we're in a heightened situation, adrenaline may be flowing, it may be hard to recall precisely what happened or what was said verbatim. So it is strongly recommended that you document and keep a record of what occurred. Next slide, please. All right, how many slides do we have left, Jamie? I want to make sure that we have time for the group work. Okay, we can go back. Thank you.
That's it. Yeah, go ahead. So we're at the time we had said, but if you wanted to cover this briefly, we can do that. Either up to you.
I think it puts a bit too much of a fine point on it. I think the last slide was, and Kathy, thank you for the questions, and the chat has been pretty active. So this was an anecdote that is not really applicable in the context of the work that you all do as advisors, as commissioners. So we will actually bypass this and we'll go to the breakouts. And thank you all for your time and attention. And Jamie, thank you for handling the slides.
Okay. All right. So yeah, so what we had in mind was to kind of have more of a conversational piece, and I think given the number of folks, rather than dividing by two, we'll just all stay together. I think that's what Terrence and Kathy and I talked about. So I just wanted to voice that, if that works for everybody. Let me just check on one thing, and then again, an opportunity as we take a little transition, maybe just, stretch a little bit. All right, this is the good part where we get to converse with each other a little bit. Yeah, so Terrence has a kind of an activity that he wants to, I think you're going to walk us through a little bit. And this is, just as a quick intro, this is an activity that you might embark on with your commission. And I think, rather than waiting until you have this moment where something happens that needs to be confronted, you can sort of, as Terrence has been talking about, build those relationships and learn to value each other. And so this is kind of something that you might do with your commission along those lines to build those relationships and to build the social capital and mutual respect and things like that that help undergird things when stuff gets hard. So, all right, I'll go ahead and Terrence, you ready to kind of, great.
I am. Thank you, Jamie. So
Oh, go ahead.
so go ahead.
Oh, sorry, you all. I think if you want, since we are a small group, I can move everyone to the attendees if they would like to panelists, which would allow them to have their video on. I'm going to try to do that. So let me see if I can. I think I can make everyone a panelist, and then if they would like to have their video on, they are more than welcome to do so. Look at that
Thank you.
All
technology.
right.
Awesome. Hey,
Hey.
Kathy. Hey,
Yes,
Jeremiah.
see everybody, see all the commissioners, see my colleague.
Right. And the other thing that we were going to talk about, Gail, is to stop recording.
Oh, so how do we?
Yes. So we're
Let's-
ready to go. We're
so
ready.
we
We're
can,
at that point. Okay.
Mhm.
I just need, yep.
yeah.
You just needed to tell me. All right. I am going to stop the recording, but let me just thank everyone for attending. And I appreciate both Jamie and Terrence's insight into implicit bias.
So we're going to keep talking. This is just the breakout room part. We just don't want to record it. So
Right.
don't go
Don't
anywhere.
leave. Right.
This is the good part. This is the part where we just get to chat.
Right. But I just want to make it for the folks that are going to watch us
Oh,
on
yeah.
demand.
Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry.
Fair.
Okay. So anyway, for the folks, again, we're going to stop the recording at this point and just want to thank everyone for attending implicit bias training.